so good to be with you, to journey with you these last few days. We're coming at the end of the Christmas season, but for us, Christmas is different with little people. We have 3 girls, 5, 3, and 1. You'll see a picture of them up there. And this year, we were asking Magdalena, she's the oldest, what do you want for Christmas? And, little person, they want, lots of things, so you would think. And what she said to me, she's like, Mom, I really want socks. I was like, all right. So every time somebody would ask her, what do you want for Christmas? She'd be like, I want socks. And then her sister heard her say she wants socks, so then we would be like, Miriam, what do you want for Christmas? And she'd be like, I want socks. And it was like, oh, okay, everybody wants socks. I think I can deliver on socks. And then I'm like, well, what do you think Bernadette wants for Christmas? And they're like, Mom, she probably wants socks too. So we had socks going around our house this Christmas. It was awesome. But one thing that they didn't know that they were getting, that they did get, was this huge swing. So I don't know if you've seen them in people's front yards. They're really big with the net, and you can fit multiple people on them. So, but in Minnesota, you can't quite use, that was kind of like a delayed gratification thing. We were like, here's your swing. And it was like, see you in April. You can use it then. And so Kevin and I were talking well, let's figure out how we can set it up now. So we set it up in our basement. And the next day, Kevin's working on it. They don't know that he's doing this, so I walk him downstairs. And you can imagine these 3 little people. Kevin's 2 feet in front of us in the doorway. And I set Magdalena here, Miriam here, Bernadette, she doesn't stand still. She just kind of does her thing. And I'm like, all right, your surprise is behind Dad. So close your eyes and start walking towards Dad. And immediately Magdalena is like as if we put, I don't know. She closed her eyes, she's like, I don't know where I'm going, And she starts yelling because Miriam is boom, totally starts going down the hallway. We're 2 feet in front of you. Just close your eyes, walk straight, And I started thinking that's what darkness does to us, right? We lose our path even if it's right in front of us, And this weekend, we have been given light. Our eyes have been opened. We have been people who have walked in darkness, and we have seen a great light, whether that was a dim last night of I think I see the Father. I trust because everybody else seems to be seeing the Father. I think he's here. Or you were dang, I didn't know the Father was here like this, but he just totally wrecked my world. But that light has dispelled some amount of darkness within you this weekend. And there's a temptation when that happens to well, let's build the tent. Let's stay here. How many of you have been I'm not ready to go back yet? The Father transfigured in front of us, right? And we're just going to pitch our tent here. But we have to go back. Because light dispels darkness. Even the smallest amount of light dispels the darkness. And each of you have a piece of the light that's going to dispel whatever darkness you are going into. But what tends to happen is that we can be filled with light, and then we start to be back in our normal routines. And sin starts to creep into our life, whether for some of us that's grave sin because the Lord's still doing work in that area in us, or it's these tiny sins of laziness. I know for me it's getting up to pray. And it starts to darken my vision of what I'm going for. What am I actually living for? What I'm living for is that at the end of my life, I want to be reunited with the Father. That's what I want. And I want to get there, and I want to experience some of his glory now. And so Paul tells us to not conform to this world, but to be transformed by the renewal of your mind so that you will know the will of God, what is good, what is pleasing, what is perfect. And so, brothers and sisters, we're just going to break this open today. Do not be conformed to this world. In some translations, it's do not be conformed to this age. This age meaning now. This time in which has not fully been fulfilled and has not fully seen the kingdom of God, has not fully been redeemed yet. And it's compared with the age to come, which is that age when all is under the reign of God. That is where we're headed, brothers and sisters. Right? And then in this translation, it says world. So like in the Bible or in like Christian tradition, there's two different ways you can talk about the world. You can talk about the world and what God has created, that which is good, but still subjective to futility and passing away and death. But it's good because God created the world and he created it good. But then there's the world in which Paul is talking about, which is kind of a society or a system or something that is actually in opposition to the kingdom, in opposition to the gospel. And brothers and sisters, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we are living in an age, in a time, in a world that is moving farther and farther and farther away from God. And if we're not careful, we're going to be swept up in that. And so this world that Paul refers to is the world we're going back into. And there's this tension in the Christian life of how do I be in the world but not of the world? How do I live a life as a Christian and not conform? And how do I be transformed? And Paul says it's by the renewal of your mind. The reason that the light could come so quickly here this weekend is because how many of you have been part of talks, have been reading your scriptures, have been having conversation, discussions, hearing people's testimony more than you've been on social media since you've been here, or more than you have read the news since you've been here? Hopefully that's like the amount of input that we are getting is like keeping us, even if you're like, oh, I can start to, oh no, we're going. Oh, I can start, oh no, we're going. Like we're all going somewhere this weekend. And what happens is that we are constantly getting input. Yeah, social media is one way, news is another way, the books we read, the shows we binge watch, the movies that we watch, the billboards that we see, even just driving, the conversations we hear in like the coffee shops, maybe the family dynamics we're in, we're constantly getting input. And what begins to happen is that input starts to form patterns of thinking in us, whether subconscious or consciously or not, whether intentionally or not, we are being shaped. And it's either for the things of God or not. And I think ever since saying yes to this talk, the Lord has just it's actually been a pretty hard season for me since July of just seeing my sinfulness and these patterns of thinking that I have that need real renewal. Because those patterns of thinking just don't live here and no one can see it. They affect the people I'm in relationship with because they actually affect the way that I behave and they affect the way that I act. Think about, so Paul says, don't be conformed to this world. So we kind of know, okay, this is the world. We know it. What does it mean to not be conformed? Well, the Greek word that actually is the word for conformed means something of an outward molding. Like it's an outward expression of a mold or a type or a pattern, right? So I think about my analogies often are like things that deal with toys. And so I think about Play-Doh. We use a lot of Play-Doh in our home. And we have these molds. And we can cram. We cram Play-Doh in those things. And if you let it sit long enough, it dries. And it's the thing. Sometimes you got to smash it out of the mold. But it's in the mold. And I pull it out and it's like a pineapple. Or it's a rainbow. Or it's a tree. Yeah, it looks like a tree. But it's not a tree. It's just conformed to the image of a tree. And it's this outward expression of a mold or a pattern. And brothers and sisters, the world has a pattern in which it wants us to be molded into. That's That's the evil one's plan for us. And it's so subtle. I think for some of us here, maybe the grave sin that we're wrestling with, like the Lord's really at work there. But for the majority of us here who have like kind of cast off some of those really like bigger things that were keeping us, it's these little things. Death by 1,000, whatever that phrase is. What is that? Death by 1,000 cuts? Finger cuts. Paper cuts. Paper cuts, not finger cuts. That was weird. Okay, anyway, but it's like these little things that begin to build that actually make us just as blind, because sin is sin. And we're all living in an age of sin. But there's hope for us. And there's a way for us, and that way is Jesus Christ back to the Father. He's paved the way for us. But these messages that the world gives us, right? The need to be happy, and not just to be happy, but to create your own happiness. To maximize your pleasure, but to minimize your suffering. To minimize your pain. The highest virtue now is niceness, or not offending people. That's the virtue. The highest virtue, actually. Tolerance has become our truth. Success and money are what people are like striving after. Beauty is only seen from an external point of view. And actually, if you don't think you're beautiful, you can just use money and change it. That's these messages that we're getting over and over and over. And what it leads to, brothers and sisters, is a fleeting happiness, control, anxiety, depression, emptiness, disappointment. Every time I'm disappointed, I can always trace it back to an expectation that I have had that was not from the Lord. Every time. Entitlement, selfishness. And we all know that, like, I don't want to be selfish. I don't want to be entitled. But we are. We are those things. And the Lord wants to do more work. And I think for us, like, yeah, maybe we're not as selfish as we used to be, but you're limiting the Lord if that's your standard. He has, like, more, like, ridding of yourself, of, like, just self. He has more for us. And so often we just limit him at what he's already done. And not only is it like what he has already done, but like the Israelites, we forget. Abe was saying this earlier, and it was part of what I was already saying, but like the Israelites' biggest issue wasn't that they worshipped idols. It was that they forgot, and what the forgetfulness led to was the worship of idols, the actual actions in which they were doing to fulfill something that they forgot. What the Father had done for them, what God had done for them. And I'm like that. My mind is like fleeting all the time. And this idea of conformity, man, this is me. Conformity. This is like the layer that the Lord just keeps going after. Because prior to encountering the Lord, I was really good at fitting into a lot of places. I could like kind of hang with the party people. I could go to mass and people thought I was like really serious about my faith. And then I could go home and do this or do that. But what it led to for me is I had no clue who I was apart from those things. And actually it was constantly changing. I was just conforming. I was putting on something that was not me. But what Paul says is that we want to be transformed. Not just like even conform to the Christian things, but we actually need to be transformed. And what does transformed mean? Well, the Greek word for that, I'm not going to try to pronounce these things. We're not going to do that. But I will tell you what it means, okay? So the word that's translated, it's like the word for transform in English would be something along the lines of metamorphosis. So if you know how a caterpillar is a caterpillar, and then it makes this chrysalis, and then from the chrysalis comes a what is it called? Butterfly. That's what it becomes. I'm teaching my children all kinds of things. basic biology. All right, so anyway, the definition of that is that it's a changing form in keeping with an inner reality. Changing form in keeping with an inner reality. Brothers and sisters, what is our inner reality? Well, if you're baptized, your inner reality is that you are a daughter or a son of the King. By your baptism, you have an inheritance. You belong to the kingdom. That's our inner reality. And what transformation does, it says, I don't want to be just me anymore. I actually want to be transformed into Christ. And you know what? We can be. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The old self has died. The new self has come. I am the new creation. Do you believe that? Like, that's our hope. That's like what he wants to do with us in this time before we return to the Father, actually to get us to the Father. He wants to transform us. Thank you. Amen. That's what he wants to do with us. He wants to transform us. And Paul says he transforms us by the renewal of our mind. By the renewal of our mind. But our minds are powerful. Our minds, even biologically, I'm not even going to try to explain the neural pathways and how all that works, but the more that you start to think something, the more you start to believe it. And we actually have to rewire the things happening in our brain. And we do that by the kind of input that comes into our life, into our self. Because in Romans it says, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, exchanged the glory of the immortal God, for something, images resembling the mortal man. Birds, animals, reptiles. That's our inclination. And this isn't just for our own self, brothers and sisters, but I don't know how long you've been on the Christian journey, but you're not promised a lack of suffering or trial. And actually, it's in suffering and trial that you begin to actually see what you really believe. You're kind of stripped of all these comforts and all these things that mask the inner, what you actually believe. I heard this talk on the Renewal of the Mind once, and he said, I want to be able to glance at my circumstances and keep my eyes fixed on the Father. Would that be so for us? That we could glance at the circumstance and keep our eyes fixed on the Father. Because our mind is there. And when our mind is there, our actions begin to follow. And so how do we do this? How do we renew our mind? I want to offer 4 ways. The first way would be study. We need to know what we believe. We need to study the teachings of the church. We need to study the scriptures. We need to know. Because, this is so innocent and silly, but Magdalena's vision for what she could ask for Christmas was socks. Come on. There is a world out there of things you could ask for. Maybe that's because we're really working on simplicity in our life and our kids don't want things already. No, I'm just kidding. That is not true. That is the opposite. But I think what it was actually her lack of vision for what she could ask for. So we need to know who is our Father, what we've been doing all weekend. Who is he? And what can we ask of him? Because so often it's us that limits him because of our lack of vision and our lack of knowing him. So we need to study. But I don't know if you know this, but Gordy, one of our founders, has recently wrote a book with Dan Keating. So Dan Keating was here giving a talk on the renewal of the mind, or during one of the breakouts. And one of the things that Gordy says in his book is, our minds will not be transformed simply through studying a truth of the faith. Our minds are transformed as we encounter, with the help of the Holy Spirit, the truths and the mystery of the revelation, cooperate with grace, and yield to the Spirit who enlightens and transforms our thinking. I think it's this age that wants to just like, the more you know, the better you are, the more transformed you are. But study, knowledge is important, but it will not stand up against trial and suffering. What we need is an encounter with Jesus. If Jesus is the Word made flesh, then every encounter with the Word, every encounter with truth is an encounter with Jesus. Every truth spoken is a speaking of Jesus. Brothers and sisters, don't we want Jesus on our tongue and in our mouths and in our spirit and in our homes, in our cars? Yes. So not only do we need to know, but then we need to pray. And this is where the evil one, he really distracts me. I live with someone lives with us who this does not, the evil one has no power over prayer in her life. And she will be up at 5 o'clock, 5:30 every morning, and I'm hitting my alarm at 7. They're not awake yet. 10 more minutes, I can't get up. No, I'm just kidding. But this is really, this is the battleground for me, is the waking up in the morning. And I fail at it often. But if I'm not putting myself in relationship with the Word made flesh, what am I doing? It's all in vain, really. It's kind of embarrassing. I think for me, I've been thinking, my husband and I have been talking a lot about people who have been really well known in the Christian life who have actually lost their faith. And I have some people that have been instrumental, a person who's been instrumental in my life in my earlier years, and then people I have actually really invested in, that all of a sudden I'm like, what happened to you? And I think, I'm not going to try to guess what happened to them, but what has come, the Lord has been speaking to me through it, is that you too, you're not far from that. You're actually kind of dangerous if you don't stay close to me, because you're going to start to build your own kingdom. I don't want my own kingdom, because my own kingdom is going to pass away as soon as I'm no longer here. I want to be about the eternal kingdom. And I think for me, I want real transformation, because in 40 years, it will be a tragedy if I'm the same person I am today. And I think that's the temptation, is I'm good enough. I've gone through real transformation. I've gone through real stripping of conforming into these things. But even in the life, I can still conform. And he wants more. He wants more. And so this starts to happen through an encounter with Jesus. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. But that's just the input. That's just the things we're receiving, we're taking in, we're letting our minds chew on. But like I said earlier, our minds are so connected with our actions. That, have you ever done this where you're you think something and then you do it and you're well, guess that's who I am because I just did it. So then it reinforces that thought. Yeah, dang. Yes. So we need to work our output, our actions. We need to start discussing these things. So that's the third thing. So study, pray. We need to discuss. So what you can't discuss with yourself. We need to be part of a people who are discussing these things, who are wrestling with these things, who are challenging one another in our lives, who are speaking truth. And not just discussion, but the fourth thing, we actually need to live it. We can talk, discuss, pray all day we want about being a servant. But at some point, unless you start serving, you ain't no servant. You know what I mean? I can talk about the goodness of prayer and praying and how good God is to encounter him. But if I'm not praying, what am I doing? I'm a resounding gong. I lack love because I lack Jesus. I lack him. He's been given to me so that I can live it. The Father has given us Jesus to die for us. He took what the truth, he took the vision and he lived it. He didn't just preach it. He lived it to the point of death so that we would have access to the Spirit to actually allow us to live. And I want to live as poorly as I can. I mean, like, it's going to look silly and messy and poor and imperfect. But I'd rather do that than just pretend that I'm like this wise person and in 40 years not know who I am. Or even in 2 years not know who I am. I want the messiness. And so we need to live it, and we can only live that with one another. And why? So, renewal of the mind. Why? So that we can know the will of God. We can prove, there's different translations. You can prove the will of God. Because we want to be in the will of God. And when you're in the will of God and you are trying to know the will of God, it stirs me on to want to be and know the will of God. And when I'm living the will of God, it encourages you to do it. We affect each other. The level of transformation that we allow to happen in our life affects the sister or the brother next to us. And I want that. And I need that. I need sisters who are messy in front of the Lord and allowing transformation because it gives me permission to be messy. And to give it to the Lord and to let him transform it. So brothers and sisters, we're going into the world. And we will experience darkness. And we need to be vigilant. There is a war for each of you happening. And you belong to the kingdom. You belong to the kingdom. You belong to the kingdom. And that means something for us. So I want us to all just stand. And we're just going to speak together. We're going to speak the scripture together. Do not conform yourselves to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. One more time. Do not conform yourselves to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of the mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. Let that be so for us.